You know who Paul McCartney is. A Beatle, a wing, half a fireman, a knight of the realm, writer of Hey Jude, Band on the Run, and Wonderful Christmastime. But more than anything, he is still to many the impish, whimsical, cute one from the Beatles, adept at silly 3-minute love songs, stuck in the shadow of his dark, sarcastic, and musically adventurous former writing partner. Of course, an oversimplification that McCartney has been at pains to correct. McCartney contains multitudes, and in 1980 he released a collection of wonky, avant-garde synth-pop, showing the world how different he could be. This is New British Canon, and this is the story of Temporary Secretary. Critically, Paul McCartney's music has often been painted as lightweight, especially when compared to John Lennon. He writes beautiful melodies instead of cutting lyrics. The perception was that Lennon was the revolutionary, the experimenter.
Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. 'Cause I'm going to strawberry fields.
Number 9.
McCartney was a balladeer flirting with 1940s music hall, what Lennon would dismiss as granny shit.
Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? Oh, honey pie, you are driving me frantic. Bang, bang, Maxwell's silver hammer came down upon her head.
But behind the scenes, the walrus was Paul. McCartney had delved into the realm of the avant-garde way before Lennon. As early as the writing of Help in 1965, McCartney had begun hanging out at the Indica bookshop in London, discovering the burgeoning electronic music of the time, including experimental composers Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Luciano Berio, as well as the atonal cacophonous jazz of Cornelius Cardew's AMM. His interest in the new world of electronic music led him to seek out Delia Derbyshire of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, famed for her painstaking work on the Doctor Who theme. In the hopes that she could back one of his best-known compositions.
Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away.
I even found out where Miss Derbyshire lived, and went round to visit her. We even went into the hut in the bottom of her garden. It was full of tape machines and funny instruments. My plan in meeting her was to do an electronic backing for my song, Yesterday.
Love was such an easy game to play.
We'd already recorded it with a string quartet, but I wanted to give the arrangement electronic backing. Tragically, he never followed it up, so it never happened. However, McCartney's interest in the avant-garde had slowly begun to spread to the other Beatles, who had all purchased tape machines to play with at home. After hearing Lennon and Ringo Starr create a particularly interesting loop in the studio, McCartney stayed up all night to create a series of loops that would be the basis for Revolver's Tomorrow Never Knows. The orchestral swells of A Day in the Life, that's him channeling Stockhausen, who was also included on the iconic Sgt. Pepper's cover art. Then, during the recording of Penny Lane in 1967, McCartney masterminded the still unavailable freeform noise experiment, Carnivore Light, a composition that reportedly makes Revolution No. 9 from a year later sound like I Wanna Hold Your Hand. I said, all I want you to do is just wander around all the stuff, bang it, shout, play it. It doesn't need to make any sense. Hit a drum, then wander onto the piano, hit a few notes, just wander around. So that's what we did, and then put a bit of echo on it. It's very free. By the 70s and the end of the Beatles, McCartney had, for the most part, moved away from his electronic avant-garde experiments. There were exceptions. Impressionist instrumental Creen Acraw was a remarkably odd way to close his 1970s solo debut. Heavy breathing and bird sounds over polyrhythmic drums. And in Wings, he would utilize the Moog synthesizer in a pop context through 1973's Band on the Run, most prominently on the solo for Jet. In the summer of 1979, he had grown bored within the commercially lucrative but album-oriented rock band dynamic of Wings, especially after that year's So-So Back to the Egg album. So McCartney took a few weeks off on his own to play around with a new crop of electronic musical equipment, to get back to where he once belonged. When Paul McCartney made his solo debut, McCartney, in 1970, it was his attempt to make something by himself, something away from the Beatles, playing all the instruments and self-recording to see what would happen. In his words, he felt like a professor in his laboratory. A decade later, McCartney II saw him in a similar position. Wings was nearing its end, and he just wanted to play around with some ideas, with no pressure to make a commercial album. I really just was fascinated with these things called synthesizers, which had appeared on the scene, particularly with sequencers. I loved them. It was new technology, and I just wanted to see what it was all about, and have a go and see what I could do with it. Because the nice thing for me is, you do an album like that, and it informs other stuff. It keeps your brain fresh, so that when you go and do something else, a tour or something, you may not be playing that stuff, but you got the feeling of being someone who's not finished yet. I'm still experimenting, you know? After a bit of tinkering at his studio in High Park Farm in Scotland, McCartney hired an array of brand new synth tech and a Studer 16-track tape machine for his farm studio in Sussex, and decided to go it alone. Future B-side Check My Machine came first, McCartney playing around with merry melody samples.
The rhino's a powerful animal, treacherous, ill-tempered, savage, thick-skinned, dumb.
Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me.
While manually stretching and echoing his own voice to a steady reggae backing, something akin to what Damon Albarn would do with Gorillaz 20 years later. Other experiments during these sessions included the robotic frog croaking of Front Parlour, the scenic, if less than PC, synth orientalism of Frozen and the ping-ponging Yamaha CS80 of standalone Christmas single, Wonderful Christmastime. Musically, these songs recall contemporary synth-pop groups like Kraftwerk, Sparks, and Yellow Magic Orchestra. But for the most part, McCartney was just pressing buttons and seeing what happened. It's probably a bit subconscious. It was more a question of, I knew who Kraftwerk were, but I didn't have their records. I would just hear it and see it and read about it. So I kind of knew what they were doing. And I knew obviously that this equipment, this new technology, had arrived. But rather than me emulating anyone, it was more a question of me seeing what I could do with it. The album's lead single, Coming Up, with its chicken scratch riff and pitch-shifting vocals, was more pointedly influenced by someone else. New York's rhythmic post-punks, Talking Heads. The only song he had before entering the studio was Waterfalls.
I need love.
a classic McCartney melody originally written for Back to the Egg, but with what he felt to be incomplete lyrics.
Don't go jumping waterfalls.
Lyrics that would later be echoed in the chorus of a 90s R&B song of the same name.
Don't go chasing waterfalls.
When I first wrote it, I liked the tune, but I thought the words, "Don't go jumping waterfalls,"
Please keep to the lake.
and
Don't go chasing polar bears.
and stuff like that. I thought that was just the first impression, and I thought I'd be able to improve on that. It's like when I wrote Yesterday. I originally had the words scrambled eggs, which I went with for a couple of weeks, so I was half thinking I was going to change the words. But eventually I played the song again to a couple of people, and they said no, I liked the words. Perhaps the oddest track on the album was Temporary Secretary. Powered by an ARP sequencer, McCartney happened upon a relentlessly bleep-blooping backing, which he once said sounded like a space typewriter. Wonkily complemented by adding halting, chiming guitar chords and crude drum hits.
Mr. Marks, could you send her quick? 'Cause my regular has been getting sick.
Well, Kraftwerk had existed for a while, and Gary Newman had had a Synth-Pop #1. Temporary Secretary sounded unlike anything else at the time.
I need a
Temporary secretary. Temporary.
Lyrically, it recalled Paperback Writer, where he had made the name of a profession a hook, entranced by the sheer poetry of its collision of words.
paperback writer.
It's like a disposable secretary, and it struck me as being funny. The song is written from the point of view of a fellow who just wants a disposable secretary, and he's writing to a bureau to try and get one. I just like the idea. I just thought it was funny, you know, asking for a temporary secretary rather than a secretary. Inspired by an advert for the Alfred Marks Bureau, the name itself tickled McCartney, as this temp agency shared its name with a pre-Goon Show radio comedian.
Mr. Marks, I can pay her well if she comes along and can stay a spell.
Is drenched in innuendo, a lonely business owner needing someone to both file his papers and file his papers.
Mr. Marks, can you find for me someone strong and sweet fitting on my knee?
But with the occasional moment of McCartney as a feminist. Like, this power dynamic isn't quite right, is it?
Help for a little while. We can take dictation and learn to smile.
The torrent of suggestive syllables in the middle eight reminded McCartney of the delivery of Ian Dury.
Here's a little bit of advice, you're quite welcome, it is free. Don't do nothing that is cutpurse.
She can be a belly dancer, I don't need a true romancer. She can be a diplomat, but I don't need a girl like that.
He intended on changing it so he didn't sound quite like the estuary punk poet. But then, these songs weren't going to get released, so what was the point? After 6 weeks of synth-pop playtime, McCartney had about 20 tracks, with little motivation to release them as any kind of album. That said, Wings played both Coming Up and Wonderful Christmastime during their December UK tour, helping promote the single release of the latter to number 6 in the UK charts.
Simply having a wonderful Christmas time.
What changed his mind was the generally warm response from those around him, and having some days to rethink his career in a Japanese prison cell. In January 1980, Wings was set to tour Japan for the first time. McCartney hadn't been able to play the country since 1966 due to visa issues relating to drug charges in the UK. Now allowed entry for a sell-out 11-date tour, the band arrived at Tokyo's Narita Airport, went through customs, and security found nearly £5 pounds of marijuana in McCartney's suitcase. Arrested on the spot, he spent 9 days in a prison cell before getting deported back home. I've asked myself, why was that pot in the suitcase? So obviously. And so much of it. I mean, there was not one hint of discretion. And if you see the film of their arrest, the guy is embarrassed to find it. He almost puts it back and closes the suitcase. Some, including McCartney, have speculated he may have done this intentionally to end his time in Wings, though they would continue in theory until mid-1981, when guitarist Denny Laine left. They never played together again. But the time entertainment led McCartney to dwell on whether he was actually enjoying his time in Wings, and reached the conclusion to go solo. He then presented EMI with his synth-based farm concoctions, the more commercial half becoming McCartney II. Exploratory lead single Coming Up was released in April 1980. And peaked at number 2 in the UK, just behind Dexy's Midnight Runners' Gino. In the US, EMI felt listeners would prefer Paul McCartney's regular singing voice to the experimental pitch shifting, so flipped the B-side, the Wings live version of Coming Up, to the A. As such, the Wings version topped the US Billboard chart. But it also meant that Paul McCartney is the only Beatle to not have a solo number 1 in the States. Ringo has 2.
But all I've got is a photograph. You're 16, you're beautiful, and you're mine.
Such a departure was coming up for McCartney that when John Lennon heard it for the first time on the radio in mid-1980, it took him a moment to identify his best friend, reportedly exclaiming, "Fuck a pig, it's Paul." The song also helped spur Lennon to make new music after a 5-year absence. What would be his last album, Double Fantasy, released in November 1980.
Just like starting over.
This desire to outdo each other had spirited the pair through the 1970s. I would listen to John's and think, oh, that same old competitive thing would come back in. I know it happened with him because people who were working with him said when he heard Coming Up, he said, oh shit, Paul's written a good one. I'll have to write a good one. It then forced him to write something good. So yeah, we were aware of each other's work. When McCartney II was released in May, the reaction was mixed. Being a Paul McCartney album, it peaked at number 1 in the UK and number 3 in the US. But critics weren't sure what to do with it. It wasn't the AOR people were used to from Wings. It was something delightfully weirder. Rolling Stone's Stephen Holden described it as electronic junk music, while the NME's Danny Baker seethed, McCartney II isn't worth the plastic it's printed on. Neither is Paul, but he'll go on doodling and fooling his public, because they're too frightened to ditch him in his past, and he's too rich to be stopped. The rest of the 80s was a critical low point for Paul. Sure, he had the opportunity to collaborate with Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson and Elvis Costello.
Side by side on my piano keyboard. Oh Lord, the girl is mine. Girl is mine. The girl is mine. Girl is mine. Baby, through the years, you know I'm dying. Ooh, 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 ooh. I know that you want it too.
But none of these ventures were ranking amongst the Let It Be's and Band on the Runs of his previous 2 decades. There was also the frog chorus. The 90s saw him secretly re-enter the realms of electronica, with his at the time anonymous work with the Fireman, working alongside former Killing Joke bassist, Youth. But it was around the early 2000s with the emergence of dance punk and electroclash that DJs like Rory Phillips and Errol Elkan at nightclubs like London's Trash started to rediscover McCartney II, alongside the danceball talk singing of LCD Sound System.
That punk is playing at my house.
And abrasive glitchiness of Fisher Spooner.
You don't need to be much.
The homemade weirdness of Temporary Secretary fit right in.
Temporary, secretary, temporary.
An indie disco dance floor filler that no one had heard, written by one of the most successful songwriters of all time. There was even a McCartney commissioned remix from mashup artist, the freelance Hellraiser. Coming up aside, McCartney himself had written off the album as a set of inelegant doodles he need not return to. A DJ in Brighton broke it and went mad on it. I hadn't heard the track for years. The common perception of me is that I did some good work in the Beatles. I may be doing some good work now, but there's a very bad patch full of rubbish in the middle. But what I like is the hidden gems like that. Because the critics said the whole patch was lousy, I'd forgotten it. And then when Temporary Secretary got picked up in the clubs, it reassured me. That's why I did it. I wanted to be different. I got a sequencer and I wanted to get into electro music. But that wasn't the only track that was given an afterlife. Check My Machine, which had been the B-side to Waterfalls, got some club play. As well as Temporary Secretary's 12-inch flip, Secret Friend. The latter, also written during the McCartney II Sessions, is the longest song he has ever officially released at 10.5 minutes. An ambient techno mood piece conjured a decade early by McCartney messing around. You think, how can the bloke who wrote Eleanor Rigby be such a weirdo? But some of Paul's stuff is so out there. McCartney II is really wild and pioneering. When I DJ, I play Temporary Secretary. Coming up, amazing. A lot of the hip hop guys love his stuff because of the rhythms. When his first two self-titled albums were re-released in 2011, a brace of disparate electronic music makers were quick to sing the praises of Paul McCartney's out-of-time oddity. From those active when it was released, like Throbbing Gristle's Chris Carter, to those that had grown up grooving to Check My Machine as a kid, like Alexis Taylor of Hot Chip and Ty Bulmer of New Young Pony Club.
Give you what you want. I can make you back real taunt.
And years before Pro Tools, the album formed a template for the future bedroom pop producer, only with a tape machine rather than a MacBook. Showing the further shifting opinion of the album, when NME put out their 500 greatest songs of all time list in 2014, Temporary Secretary was at number 167, the highest ranked Paul McCartney solo track, 8th highest with the McCartney credit after the 7 higher Beatles songs. A year later, Paul McCartney brought things full circle by playing Temporary Secretary live for the first time ever in Osaka, Japan, the country he had been banned from playing a song he'd forgotten about for 35 years. For those patiently waiting for Maybe I'm Amazed, it was a deeply confusing experience. But for McCartney, it was proof that, as well as being the cute one, he could be the avant-garde one too. Thanks for watching. So what is your favourite period of Paul? Comment down below. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and why don't you also maybe watch another one? There's many other Synth-Pop new British canons. You should check them out. As always, I'd like to shout out this month's new top tier supporter over on Patreon, Chris Abbott. And thanks to everyone else that supports me. And I'll see you in 3 weeks for whatever won the last Patreon poll.